Hello world, Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor with another short screencast. This time we're in the textbook series, so if you're using this textbook or a previous version, this YouTube is about Chapter 7, using CSS to lay out a page. And by that, we're talking about putting content into different columns. This is the final project at the end of the chapter, and you'll notice that now we have the nav in the left column, we have the image on the right, we have all of this content on the right in the second column. There are different good ways to accomplish that. One way, the traditional way, is to float content on the page and then allow the extra space on the left or right side of the item that has been floated to be occupied by subsequent content. Chapter 8 then teaches even more ways of manipulating the content on the page with grid and flexbox, which is in the next YouTube. But for this YouTube, I want to focus on what we're talking about in Chapter 7, which is mostly float. And because that can tend to be one of the most difficult concepts in CSS, I want you to know that back on my original YouTube listing, I do have several different YouTubes on floating an image, as well as several different YouTubes on responsive web design, which includes both Flexbox and Grid, to help you break down these concepts and understand how they're applied. But if we're working on the Pacific Trails Resort project or the other end of chapter project or any other project that follows the principles of Chapter 7, I want to dig into that page a little bit and show you how these two columns were created. To do that, I think the best way is to get comfortable with the inspector tools, and I'm going to right-click and inspect. This is called the inspector or the developer's tools, and you'll see this pane either docked over here on the right, or it can be docked on different places on the web page. I'm going to leave it on the right-hand side, and when you first open this, it does look like a lot of information is coming at you. But the more you can get comfortable with this, even for a couple of tools, the better off you'll be as a developer. So for example, you may question, how did the nav get to the first column? How did the rest of the content get positioned in the second column? Well, you can go through the inspector here, and I'm going to expand the body, expand the wrapper, and click the nav, and we can see that the nav is now selected over on the left. We can go down and look at the box model and see its padding and its content. There's no border or margin, but the box model at the bottom is very, very helpful. And we can even go into that nav and do another rule in this temporary window, which I find enormously helpful when my content is not being positioned correctly. And that rule is to put a border on the item. I'll use red, 1 pixel, solid. And so I've got a temporary border set on that nav. So now that small border is surrounding my nav, and I can really see where that is positioned. So I love this rule to temporarily troubleshoot where my content is. So now I can go through these rules and temporarily remove them and then add them back in to see how that affects that nav. Or I can modify any of these rules. But I'm just going to click them off and click them on again to see how each one is affecting that nav. Now, as I went through those rules, I didn't find anything about the background color, that light blue. I might wonder, how did that get applied? It's not applied from the element itself. It's got to be applied from a parent element. So if I go up to its parent, which is the div ID wrapper, I can go through those rules and try and figure out how did that background color get applied. And even when I click the background color rule, nothing seems to be happening. But if I uncheck that background image, then the background, which does that linear gradient from white to this blue color, and then I uncheck the background color. Okay, now I've figured out how that background color is being applied. So I'm merely showing you this so that you can troubleshoot your own web pages. Let's go back to the nav. The reason why in that first column is because they've made the width 160 pixels. And I just want to say something about that too. Later on, we're going to remove these large pixel measurements in our CSS. That does not work well on a small phone. So you're going to want to remove large pixel measurements in your CSS in favor of percentages, because that will then calculate and apply nicely on any size screen. And we unravel all of this in Chapter 8. But for now, we're still just styling to a large computer screen. And so she has these large pixel measurements in the CSS. So that's the reason why the nav is so narrow, because we've fixed the width to be 160 pixels. You might try some different percentages to see how that fits. 20% seems to fit really well. But in the book, if I refresh this page, I'll go back to the actual styles that are applied, and it's 160 pixels. And then you might ask, well, what created this little extra white space to the right of the nav? If I go to the parent element, the wrapper, and put in my border 1 pixel red solid, then I can see that the wrapper goes clear around the web page. I remember from my HTML that the wrapper is right after the body starts and ends right before the body ends. So that extra space to the right of the nav is not being caused by the wrapper. So let's walk down the web page and click on the div that contains that image. And when we click on the div that contains that image, we see a margin left rule of 190 pixels. If I uncheck that, see, I've got a problem. So it's that margin left rule that we have on the image, which is in the div, which is a problem that we discussed in our previous screencast in Chapter 6. We've got a 190 pixel margin left on the main. Again, if I uncheck that, I see the issue there, and I've got 190 pixel margin left on the footer. And that's why all of the content in the second column is moved over to the right, because it's got this large 190 pixel left margin. Let's go back to the nav one more time. Another really interesting style that's applied to the nav is this float left. If it's not floated left, it doesn't matter how wide the content is. The next item in the HTML is a div, and a div is a block element. It also contains this background image. Because it's a block element, it's going to want to occupy its own block, its own space on the page. So we had to float the nav left so that the space to the right of the nav could be occupied by the next block element. So that's really a key issue in this chapter, that if you want to put content side by side, and if that content is block content, then you're going to have to narrow the width of the first element to something less than 100%, so that that space by the next element can be occupied. Images, the img tag by itself is an inline element. So if you want to float content next to an img element, you don't need to fiddle with the image's width, because it's an inline element, so the space next to the image will automatically be available for the next content to float into it. But because both nav and div are block elements, we have to set the first element's width to something less than 100% before the next block element can float into that space. And again, the author has engineered this so that with that left margin of 190 pixels, there's just enough room to allow that div and the main and the footer to occupy that second column. I'm glad you're learning float in this chapter. I again highly recommend that you go slowly and carefully through this chapter. Do those little hands-on exercises. There's much more in Chapter 7, but I feel that the little hands-on exercises do a great job of taking you through that. And when you get to the end of the chapter, again, I highly recommend that you do the HTML first, and then write one style at a time, save and refresh your page to see how that one declaration applies to the page. Thank you.